You know, I had a conversation recently that stopped me in my tracks. Someone came to me, successful, accomplished, genuinely impressive human being, and they said, I've built everything I set out to build. I'm exactly where I wanted to be. So why does everyone keep asking me when I'm going to find someone, like my life doesn't count until I do? And I looked at them and I wanted to say something that nobody seems willing to say out loud. What if they're right? What if the most powerful thing you could do, the thing that would actually unleash your greatest potential, is to stay single? Not because you're broken, not because you're afraid, but because you understand something that most people have been carefully taught not to see. There's a pattern in history that nobody talks about. The individuals who bent reality to their will, who created works that outlived empires, so many of them walked alone. Not by accident, by design. And the question isn't why they stayed single. The question is why we've been so thoroughly convinced that this path is somehow lesser, somehow incomplete. Because once you understand what solitude actually gives you, what it unlocks in the architecture of your existence, you'll see that the real trap isn't being alone. The real trap is the one they've been selling you since childhood, wrapped in white lace and promises of completion. So let me take you through something, not to convince you to leave your partner or to reject love, but to show you what sovereignty actually means. And why, for some people, for the ones who see clearly, staying single isn't a consolation prize. It's the grand prize itself. There's a story from ancient Greece that haunts me. Alexander the Great, conqueror of the known world, master of armies, ruler of an empire that stretched from Greece to India, sought out a philosopher named Diogenes. He found him living in a barrel, owning nothing, beholden to no one. Alexander stood before him, casting a shadow over the old man, and said, I am Alexander the Great. Ask me for anything and it shall be yours. And Diogenes looked up at this man who commanded nations and said, yes, move a little to the left, you're blocking my sunlight. Now, the story usually ends there, with Alexander marveling at Diogenes' indifference to power. But there's something deeper happening in that moment. Alexander reportedly said afterward, if I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes. Think about that. The most powerful man in the world, envying the freedom of a man who owned nothing and answered to no one. What did Diogenes have that Alexander, with all his empire, could never possess? He had sovereignty over himself. Complete, uncompromised, undiminished sovereignty. Alexander went home to palaces and wives and obligations. He spent his evenings managing the emotions of generals, negotiating with rivals, maintaining the vast machinery of power. His time was never his own. His mind was never quiet. He was trapped inside the empire he'd built. Diogenes went back to his barrel. His time was his own. His thoughts were his own. Nobody needed him to be anything other than what he was. Now, here's what the world won't tell you. They'll tell you that Alexander won because he conquered nations. They'll tell you that having a partner, a family, a conventional life is winning. But they never ask the question that matters. Who was actually free? Who actually owned their life? And this pattern, this strange truth, it repeats throughout history. The people who changed everything, who created lasting works, who pushed human understanding forward, so many of them guarded their solitude like it was sacred. Because it was. Nietzsche never married. Schopenhauer never married. Tesla never married. Emily Dickinson never married. Beethoven, Da Vinci, Newton, Kant, the list goes on and on. And the world looks at this and says, well, they were lonely. They were damaged. They couldn't make relationships work. But what if that's exactly backward? What if they saw something most people don't? What if they understood that to do what they needed to do, to become what they needed to become, they required something more valuable than companionship? They required undivided attention to their own becoming. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because the world has convinced you that wanting solitude is selfish, that prioritizing your own growth, your own purpose, your own sovereignty is somehow a moral failing. that the highest good is to split yourself in half and give that half to someone else. But let me ask you something. Is it selfish to refuse to dilute your potential? Is it selfish to say, I have something to create that requires everything I am? Is it selfish to choose the path that makes you most fully yourself, even if that path doesn't include a +1? Nietzsche had this thought experiment. He called it eternal recurrence. The idea is simple. Imagine you had to live your exact life again, precisely as it is, every moment, every choice, every experience, repeated infinitely, forever. Most people recoil from this idea, because when they're honest, they're not living their life, they're living a script someone else wrote. The script says, get educated, get a career, get married, have children, retire, die. And somewhere in the middle of that, if you're lucky, maybe you squeeze in a hobby. But Nietzsche asks, what if you could say yes to eternal recurrence? What if your life was so authentically yours, so completely an expression of your will, that you'd be thrilled to live it again and again forever? And here's the thing, you can't say yes to that if you're living someone else's idea of what your life should be. You can't say yes to that if you've traded your sovereignty for security, your purpose for partnership, your becoming for belonging. Nietzsche wasn't against love. He was against the kind of love that diminishes you, the kind that makes you smaller, more domesticated, more housebroken. He called it the love of the neighbor, this thing where you sacrifice who you could be for who someone else needs you to be. And he talked about the Übermensch, the person who creates their own values instead of accepting the values handed to them. Now, people misunderstand this concept. They think it's about being a Superman, about dominating others. But it's not. It's about self-mastery. It's about becoming the author of your own existence. And here's what nobody tells you. You cannot become the Übermensch. You cannot create your own values. You cannot author your own existence if you're constantly negotiating that existence with another person. Because the moment you enter a traditional relationship, you accept a fundamental premise that your life is no longer entirely your own to direct. Your time becomes negotiable. Your priorities become shared. Your decisions require consensus. And slowly, gradually, almost invisibly, you begin to edit yourself. You smooth out the edges that might cause conflict. You moderate the ambitions that might threaten the relationship. You learn to want what's reasonable, what's practical, what keeps the peace. Schopenhauer understood this. He lived alone for most of his life, working in the mornings, walking in the afternoons, thinking in the evenings. He had no spouse to consult, no children to raise, no domestic drama to navigate. His time was entirely his own. His mind was entirely his own. And people called him a misanthrope, a misogynist, a bitter old man. But read his work. Read the depth of thought, the clarity of insight, the architectural beauty of his philosophy. That doesn't come from bitterness. That comes from undivided attention to truth. He wrote, "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone. And if he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, for it is only when he is alone that he is really free." Think about that. Really think about it. When you're alone, genuinely alone, not lonely but sovereign, you are free to think any thought, pursue any interest, explore any idea without justifying it to another consciousness. Your life becomes a laboratory of self-discovery rather than a negotiation table. And this is what Nietzsche meant by solitude being necessary for creation. Not isolation, not withdrawal from the world, but this fundamental sovereignty over your own attention, your own time, your own becoming. Einstein said something similar. He called it a kind of monasticism. He needed vast stretches of uninterrupted time to think the thoughts that would revolutionize physics. And while he was married, his letters reveal the cost. The constant tension between his need for solitude and the demands of domestic life. The way his work suffered when he had to be a husband and father rather than a mind pursuing truth. What the world calls loneliness, these people called workspace. What the world calls isolation, they called freedom. And what the world calls love, they often recognized as a beautiful cage. Now, let me tell you about the Stoics, because they understood something profound about human psychology. They understood that you only have control over one thing in this life, your own mind. Everything else, every single other thing, is outside your control. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in Rome, an emperor who commanded legions, spent his private moments writing meditations that reveal this truth. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. And here's what's fascinating. Marcus Aurelius was married. He had obligations, duties, endless responsibilities. And you can feel in his writing the weight of it, the constant drain of managing other people's needs, other people's emotions, other people's expectations. He found peace only in those stolen moments of solitude, writing to himself, reminding himself of what mattered. And what he reminds himself of again and again is that true peace comes from within. That external circumstances, including relationships, cannot give you the tranquility you seek. Now imagine for a moment that Marcus Aurelius had been single. Imagine all that energy he spent navigating the complex emotional landscape of marriage and family. All those resources he poured into maintaining domestic harmony, redirected entirely toward his own philosophical development, his own governance, his own becoming. Would he have been a better emperor? Would his meditations have gone even deeper? We'll never know. But the question is worth asking. The Stoics had this concept, memento mori. Remember that you will die. Not as morbid obsession, but as liberation. You have finite time, finite attention, finite energy. Every moment you spend managing someone else's emotional weather is a moment you're not spending on your own development, your own purpose, your own confrontation with mortality. And in a relationship, so much energy goes toward this management. Your partner had a bad day, you absorb it. They're anxious about something, you soothe it. They need reassurance, you provide it. And none of this is wrong, exactly. But it's a choice to direct your limited resources outward rather than inward. Epictetus, who was enslaved before becoming a philosopher, understood freedom in a way most free people never do. He said that freedom isn't having what you want, it's wanting only what you already have. And the ultimate freedom is needing nothing from anyone, including their approval, their company, their love. The single person who has embraced this Stoic wisdom doesn't avoid relationships because they're afraid of them. They avoid them because they've tasted something more valuable than what relationships offer. They've tasted self-sufficiency. They've tasted the profound peace that comes from not needing anything from anyone. And there's a story about Socrates that reveals something important. Socrates was married to Xanthippe, who by all accounts was difficult, demanding, sharp-tempered. People asked him why he stayed with her, and he said it was good practice. That dealing with her trained him in patience, the way a horseman trains with difficult horses. Now, think about what he's saying. He's saying his marriage was training. Not joy, not fulfillment, not completion. Training. An exercise in endurance. Is that what you want your most intimate relationship to be? A prolonged exercise in managing difficulty? And before you say, well, Socrates was being humble, remember this. Socrates spent most of his time in the marketplace talking to young men, pursuing philosophical truth. He was rarely home. His real life, his real love, was philosophy. The marriage was incidental. The Stoics understood that peace, real peace, is non-negotiable. You cannot compromise it away and call it love. You cannot trade it for security and call it wisdom. Peace comes from self-mastery, and self-mastery requires focused attention that partnership inherently divides. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Let's talk about the existentialists, because they understood something terrifying and liberating at the same time. They understood that you are radically, absolutely, terrifyingly free. Sartre said we are condemned to freedom. Condemned, not blessed, because freedom is heavy. When you're truly free, you have no excuses. You cannot blame your circumstances, your upbringing, your partner. You are the author of your existence, and that authorship is a burden most people desperately want to escape. And do you know what the most popular escape is? Marriage, partnership, commitment. Because the moment you commit to another person, you have a perfect excuse for every choice you make, every path you don't take, every dream you don't pursue. I would have started that business, but my partner needs stability. I would have moved to that city, but we have a life here. I would have taken that risk, but I have to think about us. See how easy that is? See how the burden of freedom dissolves into the comfortable warmth of shared responsibility? You're no longer alone in the terrifying expanse of possibility. You have a companion in the cage. But the existentialists said that authentic existence requires you to face that expanse without flinching, to create yourself, moment by moment, through choices that are entirely your own. And this is nearly impossible to do in a traditional relationship because every major choice becomes a negotiation, a compromise, a dilution of pure will. Emily Dickinson understood this. She rarely left her house, never married, spent her days writing poems that wouldn't be recognized until after her death. And people said she was agoraphobic, antisocial, afraid of life. But read her poems. They're not the words of someone afraid of life. They're the words of someone who chose inner depth over outer breadth, who chose the infinite space of her own consciousness over the finite connections of society. She wrote, "The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door. Not because the soul is cruel, but because the soul knows that depth requires protection, that true creation requires boundaries, that sovereignty requires solitude." Camus talked about rebellion, about refusing to accept the absurdity of existence, about creating meaning through defiant choice. And the ultimate rebellion, in a world that demands you partner up and settle down, is to say, no, I will remain sovereign. I will remain free. I will remain uncompromised. Because here's what nobody tells you about existential freedom. It's lonely. Not the loneliness of wanting company, but the loneliness of standing in a place most people refuse to go. The loneliness of making choices that have no safety net, no shared responsibility, no one to blame if it goes wrong. Henry David Thoreau went to Walden Pond to live deliberately, to strip away everything unnecessary and discover what was essential to being human. And you know what wasn't essential? Partnership, companionship, romance. He lived alone, worked alone, thought alone. And in that aloneness, he found something most people never find. Himself, unedited, undiluted, unconcealed. He wrote, "I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude." Not because he hated people, but because he discovered that the conversation with yourself, when it's honest and deep, is more nourishing than most conversations with others. And this is what the existentialists understood. That authentic existence, existence that is truly your own, requires you to face the void alone. Not because you're antisocial, but because the void, the abyss of freedom, is where you actually find out who you are beneath all the roles and performances. And a relationship, almost by definition, is a performance. You perform the role of partner. You negotiate your authentic impulses against the needs of the relationship. You cannot scream into the void with someone else holding your hand. You cannot confront the fundamental absurdity of existence while worrying about whether you're meeting someone else's emotional needs. The existential hero, the one who creates meaning in a meaningless universe, does so alone. Not because they want to be alone, but because authentic creation cannot be a committee project. Now, Carl Jung would have something to say about all this. Because Jung understood that the idea of finding completion in another person is not just wrong, it's psychologically destructive. We have this mythology, this poisonous fairy tale, that somewhere out there is your other half, your soulmate, the person who completes you. And Jung would laugh at this. He'd say, "You want completion? Look inward, not outward." Jung talked about the process of individuation. The process of becoming whole, not by adding another person, but by integrating the aspects of yourself you've disowned or projected onto others. Every man carries within him the feminine, what Jung called the anima, and every woman carries within her the masculine, the animus. And what happens in most relationships? Instead of integrating these internal energies, you project them. The man projects his anima onto his partner, expecting her to carry all the emotional, intuitive, nurturing qualities he refuses to develop in himself. And she projects her animus onto him, expecting him to carry all the assertive, rational, decisive qualities she hasn't owned.